Welcome to Catholic in America. Today we are going to be talking about a question that came from you, the audience, which is what happens when you get bad advice from your priest? What should you do if you're Catholic? Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Catholic in America. So, can priests give bad advice? I mean, I had someone say to me. I mean, you were talking about someone came to you. I had someone say to me, I heard the Pope is infallible, and so I just assumed his priests were all infallible as well, and would give good advice, but they're going to give me anything that's flawed, right? So, how do we answer that?
Well, I gave bad advice once. I'm
assuming they were talking about somebody else, not us.
Hopefully any thinking, rational person can understand, and if not, we're explaining to you today that priests in our advice and our off-the-cuff remarks and our observances of things, even sometimes on this show possibly, are not speaking infallibly. We don't always perfectly represent what the church teaches or the voice of God. And this is important because people take very seriously what we say. It's one of those things, I think, and then we can get more into this as first of all, priests aren't always infallible, and yes, we often can give bad advice, but people take our word very seriously, and I think that's where it can be detrimental and even destructive for some people if a priest is intentionally, thoughtfully, and consistently giving bad or even unorthodox, heretical teaching or advice.
And I think that's two different things too, intentionally or just giving bad advice. I think that can be two different things.
Yeah, well, I mean, what was I think?
Some guys aren't often, like on this show, we're not intentionally saying something wrong. We're not intentionally giving bad advice, or at least I don't think we are anyway.
I'm trying to intentionally give good advice.
I think it also comes down to like the reason for why you're getting bad advice. So, I mean, if you ask me about the stock market, like I'll give you my advice, but I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert in certain things. I think what we're kind of focusing like for this one is like, when you come looking for spiritual advice, or you come looking for a teaching of the church, or how to live out the Catholic faith, and that's actually the context of the question which I received is like, what happens when you go to confession, right? And you're in the context of confession, you hear something that your priest tells you is okay, and that you just know that that's not the teaching of the church. So, for instance, like a person's in confession and they're like confessing to, okay, well, Father, forgive me, Father, I sinned. I looked at pornography and I masturbated, and then the priest says to this person, oh, well, don't worry about it. Masturbation's not a sin. And you're just like, oh. Yeah. This is not just that one time. Throughout my at least 14 years of priesthood, like I've heard multiple times people come to me and ask me, like, this priest told me that it's okay for me to use artificial contraception. A lot of it oftentimes is around the sexual morality and things like that.
Right.
But it's not always that. It can be like the priest that I had back in my parish told us that as long as you come to Mass, don't worry if you miss every once in a while, or don't worry, like it's not that big of a deal if you miss Mass. And so like priests who are giving unsound and unorthodox advice, oftentimes in the context of confession or in casual conversation, they'll say, oh, don't worry about it, that's not a sin, or that's not a big deal. And I think that at least for the persons that I've talked to, like especially because Catholics who are trying to be faithful to the teachings of the church are struggling sometimes with those same teachings of the church, and then they're getting bad advice, but not just bad advice, unorthodox advice.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes it can be, and I think this is why it's always important not to jump to like judging that priest. Sometimes the way things are heard, I think all of us have when we said one thing and someone heard something else, or they heard it from their own lens. They said, oh, it was okay for me to do this or that. I've had people that told me, well, I was in this adulterous relationship, and I brought it to a priest, and they told me, it was okay. It told me because whatever. And I'm trying to think, and I'm thinking like, I can't imagine a situation where a priest's like, oh, that sounds great. You should do that. But it's possible that the priest was trying to say like, well, God still loves you. God is with you. God's trying to help you to do the right thing. You're in a difficult situation. Like whatever it is, whatever nuance maybe he was trying to have, or he might have just misspoken or said it incorrectly or not had a second cup of coffee that day.
Right.
But the good news is we can't change the moral teaching of the church. We can't change church teaching. Pope Francis can't change church teaching. Like that we recognize we have the deposit of faith that we're all adherent to. So within that context, then sometimes you have to say, what's the pastoral application of this teaching? That's where it gets difficult. If someone's coming to you and they're in a difficult marriage situation, or they're living with somebody else, or they're struggling with a particular sin or addiction, how do we love them where they are and try to move them, not just to condemn them because they're in that sin? Because let's face it, if someone comes to confession, then they're kind of they're serious about their faith in one way or another.
Something.
They're seeking something. So there's something really good there. But I do think I've encountered it before where priests, probably because their own formation was bad, their own seminary formation or their church teachings on sexual morality, other things too, where they thought that they could excuse things like artificial contraception. This is kind of the line from the 70s and 80s, particularly in seminaries, that would say, well, as long as your conscience is okay, then
the primacy of conscience argument.
Right, which is a misapplication of the church's understanding. Because conscience does have primacy, but that's a misapplication of that.
Right.
To say that, well, as long as your conscience is okay, well, you've already had 3 kids or 4 kids, you don't need to have any more, so you can go ahead and have your tubes tied or other things too.
That's the one I've also heard multiple times is a person says, oh, well, the priest will, like, you've already had 5 kids, just go out and get your tube side or get a vasectomy, and that's very troubling because
that's not what the church teaches, by the way. And there's lots of reasons for that.
It's not, but it's not just that. This is also why priests who give bad advice is also a source of scandal, because it's not just that, because it's the people who are saying, well, my priest said this, and then the other persons are like, well, my priest told me that was a grave sin,
right?
And I can't receive communion,
right?
Or it's like I'm married outside the church. And I'm not married, I don't have an annulment, things like that. We're married outside the church, and there's a person over here at this parish who is not receiving communion, and then they're hearing from the priest across town says that you can come here and it's not a problem, you just come and receive communion. So it's especially for persons who are looking at it from the perspective of the laity, it's very confusing.
Yeah.
So maybe can I ask? Like I'm just trying to think, because I think this is on the perspective of a lay person receiving this bad advice. How do they process that? Like recognize
what do they do?
What do they do? Because that's maybe the next thing is do they okay? Are you going to get into that? Because I would love to see what do they report the priest? Is there a hotline?
That's on here too. So what should
is there an inquisition that we can call?
So what should a layperson do when a confessor or a counseling priest tells them it's okay to do something contrary to the moral teachings of the church? I mean, should they follow their advice? I mean, that's the first question.
Well, if you know something is immoral, then no matter who tells you it's okay and it's moral, then this is the primacy of conscience, because conscience can't create something of morality or immorality. It has to make a judgment of how am I called to respond to that. Then you cannot do that advice. You can't do, if you know something to be untrue or immoral or heterodox, if the priest is like, hey, you should go worship that statue of Baal, then you should be like, all right, I respect this guy and I'm tempted to worship that statue, but I'm not going to, because I know it's not true, even though Father said it was true, which would be weird that he would say that. But.
Right. So
not completely unknown to history, though.
Yeah.
So who's responsible in that situation, though? I mean, let's just say you have the parishioner, they come in, they get the bad advice. It's sketchy enough that they're not for sure. It's an issue they're not well formed on. And so they're asking the priest for this reason. The priest gives them bad advice and they follow through on it.
Well, I'd say that I think that it's important to if you're receiving bad advice, it's very different than if you've heard about someone who's received bad advice. So I think that's where if you've heard that the priest supposedly said this, and it's through the grapevine, now it's 1 or 2 persons removed. I think that's where to a certain extent, there has to be a certain level of compassion, of recognizing that person, what you were saying before, what that priest might have actually said in the context of confession might be different than what the person heard.
Yeah.
Right. And so the priest might have actually given theologically sound advice or pastorally sound advice, because that's the whole thing that, as a pastor, as we know, as confessors, I can pastorally, usually when I'm hearing confessions, right, and that's part of the penance, is that I try to give a penance which is suitable to what the person is, but also it's the next step. That's the way I kind of look at penance. Yeah. I'm going to give the person the next step. So let's say that I have a person who comes and confesses that they're married outside the church, right? Well, that's a process. Like that's as we know, that's a 9-month process in some cases, sometimes 2 years or more.
Yeah.
Right. So then the question becomes like, what's the next step that I can give to that person to bring them back into alignment with the church? And I might not be able to instantaneously get them back into full communion with the church, but I can give them the next step. And if that person's taking that next step, then like that's the whole thing. Is like sometimes the priest in confession is hearing the confession and is giving the person the next appropriate step that they can take so that they can make come into full communion, right? And so that's the thing is like, person, you hear this through the grapevine, like that might not make sense because in that sense, like confession is the medicine of the soul, and we're called to be physicians in a certain sense, giving the proper type of penance, which is your medication. Like, what are you called to do? So I think that first of all, like it's like that first recognizing, like when there's the propensity towards scandal, like recognizing that the scandal is more often not done through hearsay. This priest said this verse is going in.
It's almost always that way, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah,
it's almost always.
But I think that if a person does hear bad advice and gets it directly one-on-one from the priest, like I think that you ask the priest to please clarify. Right? Please clarify because that's confusing to me.
This is what I heard, Father. Is this?
Because I would say like if I were to hear, if you gave me bad advice, I'd say, Mike, I think that Father Mike, I think that the church teaches this. Can you please explain to me how that is? So asking the priest if you believe you're getting bad advice, you ask the priest to please explain to me what you mean by that. Now,
maybe even with good advice too, but especially
please explain to me further. Yeah. That's kind of his job. He's called to be a teacher to explain it, especially if he's giving something which is controversial. Like, so please explain to me what that is. And then if he doubles down, you can go and fact check him.
Yeah, right.
You can ask a different priest, or you can go and read the catechism, or you can go and look it up and find it. And then what you're saying, like if you realize like the priest is not giving you sound orthodox advice.
That's the next question.
That's the next question. You have the right to call his superior.
Yeah.
Which in some cases might be the pastor. If you're dealing with parochial vicar, you report I would say
visiting priest
or visiting priest. Like you talk to the pastor.
So you don't always just go straight to the Vatican with these things.
No, you go to the next rung up. If it's a parochial vicar, you notify the pastor and ask the pastor for this so that he can then maybe he can deal with that issue.
Sure.
And if it keeps happening, right, or if it's the pastor, you always have the. Now I don't want this because I don't want Bishop Bill to be inundated all of a sudden with hundreds of letters. But people do have the canonical right to inform the bishop.
Yeah. They do,
and they do have that canonical right.
I would say too, and this is important as well because we still have those vestiges. It's not everywhere, not very consistent of where we put priests on a pedestal.
Not anymore, anyway.
Well, no, but sometimes people do have it. Very well-meaning people, which is why it's so difficult for them when a priest gives faulty or heretical advice. But even to say like, hey, I'm bringing this to you, Father, about this advice I received from this other father. I sought to clarify from him. This is what he said. He doubled down on it, or he restated it, and gave me a a Hans Kung book to read or something like that. That like just to ask the pastor, okay, I brought this up, and then to request from the pastor when this is addressed, if you could let me know. Mm-hmm. Like even like because in a sense we kind of like. It's very easy, and this is far away from the abusive tendencies and dark stuff that have happened in the history of the church or in clergy circles and things. But part of this stuff coming to the light is baptized Catholic Christians knowing their rights within the church, and if you're bringing up something, then you also have the right to respond, whether it's from the pastor or from the bishop. Like what exactly was the action taken? What was this discussed? Was it and so just kind of like. Father, I hate to bring this up to you, but this is the thing. And Father being like, it will be taken care of in secret meeting time that we have. It's like no, this is something serious. It was publicly, in a sense, it's publicly said, and that it's said out loud. And if you're celebrating a liturgical action, which any sacrament is in a sense a liturgical action, confession, then there's something really important about that, and really has a certain authority behind it. And the Catholic faith will have the right to know that this is being taken seriously and being addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, especially in that situation, because even though it's in private and we can't talk about it, once it's brought out like that, I mean, especially if it's bad advice, I mean, they got to know that they can trust the priest that they're going to for confession, because if they can't trust them to give them the proper advice, the proper spiritual medicine, if you will, it can create it can create mistrust in the community.
Yeah,
and dissension as well.
And it's a difficult conversation to have. I'm a pastor, so I've had a parochial vicars, and I've had priests, priests in residence or visiting priests or priests that help out with things. Where certain things are brought up and not maybe as serious as what you're discussing, where I've had to talk with those priests about it. Yeah. And that's uncomfortable, but
that's accountability.
That's accountability,
that's brothers keeping each other accountable.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say I've never personally received bad advice in confession. I've never received anything which was unorthodox myself.
Well, I wish I could say that.
Yeah, well, that's what I've not.
I wish I could say that. Yeah.
But I think the other dynamic, though, is that sometimes it's difficult in this because if it happened in the context of confession, priest, you can't say anything.
Right. The priest can't.
The priest can't say anything.
The person can.
Yeah, the person can. And but also the other difficulty is that the priest can't defend himself for anything that he's done in confession. He has to remain silent. And so that's also the thing. But that doesn't mean that the pastor can't, like you're saying, if the pastor hears or the bishop hears that something is going on which shouldn't be happening or advice, that he can't address it on a universal like this and making sure that it's known to the priest in the house or the diocese that this is not acceptable advice. And so that's the thing is that there are ways of handling it, even that still respects the sacramental seal and the fact that the priest can't.
Yeah. So and just so people are clarified, so if someone's like, Father X told me this in confession, and he's, and I'm his superior, I can't go to him and be like, did you tell them that in confession? Right. He can't answer. I can't ask that. He can't answer it. So now I can say like, hey, look, I got a complaint about this in confession that it came up. And so when you're hearing confessions, you need to make sure, and I need a verbal agreement, yes, that the advice you're giving in this area, whether it's sexual matters or personal matters or other things too, is in line with the church teaching. And that's something that you have to make very clear to that person, because if not, you're doing damage to the church. And if that continues, then we're going to have to talk about whether you should continue to celebrate the sacrament of confession or meeting with people too. But I think too, this bleeds over into the area. If I'm okay with sort of, freestyling my advice to people, again, how important and impactful a priest's authority can be over somebody. And we've seen far too many cases in the Catholic Church, outside of the Catholic Church, not even in secular institutions, of where you can influence people in negative ways, obviously in abusive situations, but also just for your own benefit or influence decisions. And as soon as you start to voice opinions on things, that's it's damaging. I remember I had some people bring to me a very fraught topic, and it was about all sorts of things. It was something that I felt very strongly about, but they had freedom there, and I had to ensure that I did not say my opinion on what they needed to do, because they needed freedom to make that decision. It was about their family. It was about all sorts of stuff. And so if I'm like, well, God calls us to do this, or God calls us to be like, as soon as I say that, I'm overstepping and can be stepping into a place where it becomes about me and becomes about like, well, Father's a holy man. I can trick people into thinking that, right? And Father thinks a lot about this, but I'm not having to deal with the ramifications of that. I'm not having to deal with this situation in their family. I'm kind of more thinking, so just being able to help them to process it and is a big part of the priesthood. And it's an art, not a science. So sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't. But just recognizing from people that the priest can't tell you that, well, you need to sell your house, or you need to move to this place, or you need to, come to me with any big life decisions. That's not what the church teaches on these areas. No. That we're called, we have freedom, and we have integrity, and we have discernment, and we can help you to discern, but we're not supposed to be making decisions for you. Because as soon as that starts to become the norm in a parish or in a spiritual relationship, that's where you're open yourself to manipulation or even abuse.
But I do think that's what people often think spiritual direction is. I mean, I've been in that situation where someone has come to me and said, I need to know what to do. Can you give me spiritual direction? And I'm like, I can't tell you what to do. Yeah. I can help you work through this issue, but I can't, I can't make this decision for you. And I think sometimes that's what people think spiritual direction is. So would you speak to what spiritual direction kind of really should be? I mean, you've already spoken to it somewhat, but just kind of in a more direct way.
Spiritual direction is helping people to be more open to and docile to the voice of God speaking in their lives, and consistent with their state in life, consistent with the moral teachings of the church, consistent with but also faithful to what is God actually saying in that person's life, which the priest or the spiritual director, because not just priests who are spiritual directors, could be lay people or religious sisters or brothers or other people too that are trained in that. They're trying to hold up a mirror to the person instead of trying to say like, oh, you know what you need to do if you do this, this, and this. They can give you suggestions, be like, maybe you should try praying this way, or you should try. You had a lot of. You prayed with that gospel story, and it really moved your heart. Why don't you go back to that and see what God's still saying there? So it's the opposite of advice giving. Right. It's really Pope Francis calls accompaniment, which I think is really important. But sometimes people don't want that; they just want people to give them advice,
right,
or to tell them what to do.
Yeah, not even necessarily advice. Give them directives and tell them what to do. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I would say that my understanding of spiritual advice or counsel or direction. And there's a little bit of difference, obviously, between those terms. But for the common Catholic, I don't think that they really recognize, know the difference. But spiritual counsel or spiritual direction, I'd say, is to empower the person to make decisions themselves. Empower the person to be able to, one, hear the voice of God, and to be able to recognize His voice more clearly, and then to take personal ownership over their own spiritual life, so that you're not just a child who's codependent upon your priest to do all these things. And no, you are empowered, you know the Spirit. That's the whole point of spiritual direction, is that the priest empowers the person and helps the person to determine and to hear the voice of God themselves. It's not Father's voice, which gives me the voice of God. It's, I can now clearly discern God's voice by opening up those gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so that's the purpose of spiritual direction as well as spiritual advice, is to help the person to hear God's voice more clearly so that they are empowered, so that when Father's not there, they can still be connected to God. Yeah. Otherwise, the person becomes connected to a personality or a priest.
And that's a problem.
And then it becomes this unhealthy, spiritually codependent relationship where the person can't actually discern properly for themselves.
Yeah.
And I would say if somebody finds themselves in that situation, if someone listening maybe finds himself in a place where I feel paralyzed and I feel like I have to talk with Father, maybe Father's intimated to me like, any decisions you should speak to me about. Like, to recognize, all right, that's, maybe there's something unhealthy going on there. Maybe there needs to be a little bit of some boundaries that are set, even if no untoward sort of thing. And it's okay that a priest is in a position of authority. So it's okay for a person to say like, hey, Father, I think I need a little more space here. That you do have those rights. And I think, like for a priest who gets upset or offended by that to me shows that they're already overstepping spiritually the boundaries that are in place.
Yeah. So kind of brings us to a question of how should we perceive or look to priests as leaders, as spiritual directors in this way?
I think they're recognizing, one, that every priest is, by his calling, by his vocation, he's a father, right? He's a pastor, he's a father, he's meant to father you, but ultimately he's also, as a father, meant to empower you. So recognizing in the same sense that your father is flawed, right? But you're also, your father typically knows more than you. And so in this sense, the spiritual fatherhood, like your priest is supposed to know the moral law, and he's supposed to give you sound advice. Like he's supposed to give you at least sound advice in the sense he's not telling you to do things that are immoral. So but then you get that question of justice, like what's moral, what's right, and what's wrong. But then you get into a question of applicability and prudence, like what is prudent advice, wise advice, and that's where your father and the spiritual priest is meant to kind of craft and to give you that advice particularly. That's why this one size fits all type of advice that a priest might give you, like that might not work. So but in that sense, like you're called to look to him, but also recognize you're dealing with a human being, and he is not infallible.
Right.
And it might be like depending upon various different things, like he might have poor formation, or he might not. Like he might also be talking over your head. And that's the thing that I've come to discover a couple times. I'm sure that I made mistakes multiple times, but I assume that people understand what I'm talking about. Yeah. And they're like, yes. And I realized later, I'm like, they didn't understand what I was talking about.
Yeah. We have no idea what you've been saying.
I haven't heard anything.
We've just been smiling.
Smiling on. And you're like, yes, Father. But so recognizing if you're confused by what he's saying, you ask questions. Yeah, that's the whole thing. It's like it's meant to be a dialogue.
You have a right to do that, particularly in confession. Some people think they can't once Father goes on his monologue, responding to your sins. So being able to ask clarifying questions,
even about your penance, you can
even
ask
about your penance, clarifying. I would say too,
you can also ask. You can also tell the priest, just so people don't know. You can tell the priest that penance I can't do.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he can give you, and he can give you a different one.
I have had people bring up that a priest, for whatever reason, gave them a nearly impossible penance of like every day for the next 7 months doing some sort of action or prayer or something like.
I had to do that. I was given the Psalms one time.
Indeterminate penance.
Yeah, an indeterminate penance.
Which is not permitted.
I was given all 150 Psalms.
150. I know someone who was told to read the entire Bible.
Yeah, see.
Which obviously I think that reading the entire Bible is a great idea, but I'm not going to give reading the entire Bible as a penance.
Yeah, you can make their penance dependent
So
on
if someone
that.
does bring that up, actually, if they bring up an indeterminate penance or an impossible to fulfill penance,
or overly onerous,
if they bring that to me as a priest, I'm going to let them know, okay, you are released from that for your penance, whatever it is, saying Our Father, something. Again, the penance is not meant to win salvation. Jesus wins salvation by his death on the cross. It's meant to unite ourselves to that in a very intentional way. Like, as you said, taking those steps in that direction. I think, too, recognizing as well, if you've heard somebody got bad advice from a priest, not to repeat that to other people, not to say, because that becomes then on you a sin of scandal or a sin of gossip or of detraction, which are serious sins. But I would say too, for the most part, priests, and I would say this is years and years of going to priests for spiritual direction and confession, are giving good advice. They're helping me to experience the Lord's love. I've experienced so many great things there. So we bring all these things up just to help people to know what to do if you're in this unenviable situation. But for the most part, priests are doing what they need to do, and it bears abundant fruit. Going to confession on a regular basis, having a spiritual director, I think, are really, really helpful. One of the ways that we can help priests too, maybe this is a good thing for lay people just that are watching, people who are not priests, is just to help priests to do their job better, so to speak, is even kind of to recognize that priests are not robots. Like this can happen where where you have an evening mass and you're in your third hour of confessions, you're finishing up those confessions, and then someone, you're like, I'm sorry guys, there's maybe more people waiting, and you got to get several things ready for mass, and then someone's like, well Father, this will just take a minute, and just kind of like inserting themselves in that and sharing whatever sins they are. In a sense, that's a disservice to the priest to think like this will just take a minute, this confession, just because it's kind of like, oh, I just want a quick one.
A shower. I just want to sprinkle a shower.
Just and it's kind of like, in a sense, that's sort of, and sometimes you really need a priest, you really need to talk to a priest, and I get that as the exception, but some people almost kind of get miffed or mad at the priest because we're not doing it on their terms. Just real quick, we could stand here and just have a confession, because that's in a sense, it's devaluing our own humanity. That's part of this sacrament, but also too the power and importance of this sacramental action. And I think some people kind of put their own needs. I need to have that endorphin hit of feeling forgiven. And so Father is kind of subject to me. So kind of like recognizing that, saying like, all right, if I need to go to confession, it's outside the regular time, I'm going to make an appointment. I'm going to make an appointment with the priest to talk to the priest about this. And just those so it gives the priest kind of an opportunity to actually settle into the conversation. Because if you just, someone's doing something completely different, they're like, hey, I got this terrible problem, this horrible situation. What do you think I should do? And they're like, oh, your response.
You might not get the best advice.
You might not get the best advice, but being able to take seriously, like, okay, this is something that you need to recognize and give them space to be able to function well.
Maybe if it's priests, we gave our worst penances in that moment, that might, no, I'm kidding.
Read 150 Psalms.
Yeah, that's right. I read every Psalm. So, So when we're talking about the advice we're given, the kind of counsel we're given, one of the words that we've used once was orthodox. So what do we mean by orthodox advice or unorthodox advice? And how can someone know the difference between those two things? Because we're not asking them to come into the confessional being like, I want to make sure this guy's giving me the right advice. But when they hear something, how will they know?
Yeah, so if you hear something, you're like, oh, I've never heard the church teach that before. That's a good thing to ask that question. Is this what the church teaches? Is the church, because I get this from some people, I guess the church changed on this. Because we used to believe this one thing, but then, and oftentimes that's just a misunderstanding of the way church practice certain things.
Right.
That those practices do and have changed, not only in the past 50 years, but throughout the history of the church. But orthodoxy is right belief. And basically that means that I'm teaching, what the sacred scriptures, the magisterium, and the tradition of the church what have consistently held and taught. That's right belief. That's orthodoxy. So we have we're talking about that. That's in union with the Orthodox churches, obviously, but that right belief is kind of the standard for good advice.
Yeah.
And then you get into the creative aspects of how do I apply this to my life. But yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the basics of it, at least in terms of more normal advice that we're kind of talking about today, is it sound and moral? So sound and moral is in keeping with the dogmas, doctrines of the church. But dogmas and doctrines, typically, the dogmas have to do with the creed. So what do we believe as Catholics? But then the application of our faith in terms of morality in our daily lived life, as well as how it plays out in the sacraments, specifically in the sacrament of marriage, and likewise. So knowing basic morality, your 10 Commandments, right? And then the priest can't justify. So how do you know if he's giving you sound advice? Because it's in keeping with what the teachings of the church are in terms of the commandments and also the application of the commandments in the daily life. So if the priest is giving, that's how you kind of know, is can you please, to a certain extent, you can ask, where's that in the catechism?
Right. Yeah.
Because that's why we have a catechism. We have a catechism which is a synthesis of all of our dogmas and doctrines and applications. So where is that in the catechism?
We have a section for moral life. And
correct.
Well.
That's absolutely. It's a major section of the catechism. So where is it in the catechism? And knowing basic morality, that's the whole thing. Is if you know your basic morality, your 10 Commandments, you're going to confession pretty regularly, most people, I think, do know when they're getting good advice or when they're not getting good advice.
Yeah, and like you said, it's okay to ask and say, Father, what was that again? Or, I didn't understand it that way. It's okay to ask those things. I think sometimes, especially, maybe if someone's not regularly coming to confession, or if they, there's certain circumstances where they may not feel comfortable doing that, or they may not think, I'm not supposed to do that. Or maybe they've had a priest who's told them they're not supposed to do that. You have every right to do that. And so,
absolutely.
But speaking about this, and because you may hear this too, every now and again, I hear some people say that the church is struggling with a crisis of unorthodoxy. That I've been told, we have more unorthodox priests than ever. Those kinds of just kind of off-cuff comments. What do we respond to with that? Because some of it comes from this. Some of it comes from preaching in homilies. I hear it all the time. It's bad homily or whatever. And then,
I think there's a difference between a bad homily.
Sound advice.
There's a difference between a bad homily and a unorthodox or heretical homily.
Yeah.
So there's
you heard both.
Yeah,
I've heard both.
I've also heard bad homilies that were also unorthodox.
Right.
Or were heretical. And I've heard great homilies that were also heretical.
Right. Sure. Someone who delivered it very well with a lot of punch. That you're like, that's great.
That was great. Yeah. That was a great heretical homily. Yeah.
So what do we say to that? Is there a crisis that's happening? In other words, is the church trustworthy at this point?
It would be interesting to me for people who bring that up, what their political leanings are.
Yeah.
Because I think, we're Catholic in America. That's our show here. So we're in the American context. This is an election year. I think oftentimes people lump everything in those terms. So Orthodox means conservative, or unorthodox is liberal. And so if Father, it preaches about racial injustice in our country, then he's now liberal. When that would just be an authentic Christian and Catholic who would talk about that and engage with that in appropriate ways. Or he talks about abortion or whatever the case might be. So I think it'd be interesting. Immigration, where you kind of try to say okay, calling him a lefty doesn't quite work, or a liberal. So what's another thing? Oh, he's a heretic. It's maybe it is on Father, maybe it is on the person too, that we need to recognize. Oh, maybe I've been putting my political party ahead of what my church actually teaches about these issues and topics. So that's possible, to be maybe part of the problem here as well. So I don't think we have a huge glut of unorthodox priests. I think there's certain priests who were educated at different times in the history of the church, and guys who went through the Second Vatican Council, all the turmoil and turnover, and priests leaving the priesthood during that time, and being told by their seminary professors who were getting ready to leave the priesthood, oh, everything's about to change. For those guys that stayed faithful there and are still priests today, my hat is off to them. God bless them for their fidelity through very difficult and trying times, and they might not be as, and this is this is a caricature, but they might not be as theologically precise as I would like, or liturgically consistent or clear, as I think the people of God deserve. But I'm not gonna besmirch them or tear them down as this awful person because they don't do things exactly the way I want them to do, because they weren't formed like I was formed. I was formed in a time. I think there was some turmoil in the seminaries and stuff, but there's a lot more clarity, a lot more consistency. I think the goodness and truth and of John Paul II's pontificate, with Ratzinger as the head of the CDF, and then Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI. I think those were the theological foundations for my time in seminary. So I feel very blessed by that. Not everyone had that same experience. So I think priests that are coming out today, for the most part, I see very strongly orthodox, dynamic men who are becoming priests.
Same. Will that save the church, though? Will orthodoxy save the church?
Christ saves the church.
That's right. Only Jesus.
so, and Jesus is one. There's only one Jesus.
Right.
There's one teachings and things like that, but there's also teachings which are given with compassion.
Right.
And I think that's sometimes where people perceive unorthodoxy is the application of the teachings. And so the teachings are clear, the teachings are certain, the teachings are unchanging, although we understand them better, right? They don't evolve in a macro sense. Like, they don't change, and we're not going to ever go from saying that whatever the particular thing is, the church is not going to say that artificial conception tomorrow is okay.
Right.
Like, it's not going to say that abortion tomorrow is okay. Church is not going to say that tomorrow adultery is okay, or that stealing is okay. Like, and if the priest ever tell that a person that the person has to follow their conscience and what their sense of right and wrong is, because the priest is not infallible. And so I would say this: the priest is also in that sense responsible for the advice he gives. He's morally responsible, and he's going to have to show it and make an accounting before God, right? On the other hand,
which we're told as leaders is very high.
But the other thing is this: is like the confessee or the person who's coming to the church, priest seeking advice, is also reasonably responsible for what they also receive. So if they hear something which is absolutely ridiculous, right, and they do that because Father said so, like, there's reasonable responsibility that the person who's coming also has to exercise in terms of their own free will as well as their own faith. So like, that's where people find it. So I think that where I perceive a lot of problems where they're coming from is in that you might actually have an Orthodox priest who's trying to apply it in a particular situation, being pastoral, right? So the pastoral application and working with the mess of a person's life and trying to extract them and being pastoral. And so like, that's the whole thing, is like, we have pastoral discretion, as we all three of us know, to help people. And so that's where people don't always see the pastoral discretion that I'm trying to save a person or help, or at least allow the Holy Spirit to use me to influence this person for their salvation. So that's where I think that a lot of people get upset, because they're just like, well, Father said this. Well, one, you weren't in the confessional with the person.
Yeah, and you don't know the context at all.
Is it actually, is this person actually, the priest is actually, and you're hearing what they're saying. So like, are we dealing with a pastoral application? And that's where there's this perception I see in the culture where people are like, we have all these liberal priests and things like that. Like, it's not that they're necessarily liberal, it's that they're trying to help individuals take the next step in their process of conversion. But then you do have sometimes some rotten apples.
Sure.
We know, I mean, the whole history of the church, we've always had rotten apples.
Of course.
Like, of Jesus' original 12 apostles, like, one of the 12 was rotten, right? So that means that Jesus' success rate is 92% success rate, which is not even 100% because he's dealing with broken humanity. Go back to the Old Testament. There's been bad priests all the way back to Eli, right? Eli and his bad sons and things like that.
About 2% success rate going back to the
but my point is like, I think that the laity, we need to be charitable all the way around, but like, also that we also recognize, like, we have to take responsibility for our own lives. And where the Holy Spirit is moving, directing you, like, that's why we can't become overly reliant upon the church, which is, I think, that this mentality, at least that I've heard from the time, is that the priest said it, therefore it's what everyone has to do, and that's just that's I'm not even sure if that was actually accurate at that time. Knowing human beings, there might be people who can say the priest told me to do this, but it's more of a justification, On the other hand, if the priest did tell a person to do that and they did that, like the priest is responsible.
Yeah.
Morally responsible for that.
So pray for priests.
Yeah.
Pray for priests.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, well, and we'll be praying for you as well. So thank you for joining us on Catholic in America for this important conversation. Join us again soon.